So, of course, I'd like to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're discussing custom properties, balloons, and bill of materials in Onshape. And so it's kind of a series of random topics that have a common theme in the idea of assembly drawing. So we're going to spend some time today discussing these three topics, and most importantly, how these have changed over the last few months. I think it's going to be a very short webinar. We're just really going to walk through the custom properties aspect of Onshape, how that ties into the associative balloons that were recently added, and of course the new simultaneous bill of materials. Those three items make a significant difference if you're creating a lot of assembly drawings. So that's kind of the target. The topic for today is these three things. If you have any questions, as I always say with these webinars, I really encourage you to ask any questions. There's a questions section in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask any question that you'd like, and I'll do my best to stop and answer all the questions as we go through things. As I mentioned before, this is going to be a very short webinar because this workflow has just gotten substantially easier in the past few months. So let's dig into it. Now, I want to start with just a brief agenda. I want to start with an introduction to the Simultaneous Bill of Materials tool, and I'm going to start with a very short introduction just to explain what it is if you haven't seen it yet. But I really encourage you, if you haven't already, to check out the videos we've done on Simultaneous Bill of Materials, the webinar we did, I believe, last week on Simultaneous Bill of Materials. So lots of new content surrounding this functionality that goes into much more depth. The introduction I'm going to do here today is just going to be just to get you started with the bill of materials and how do we get that into the drawing. But then I want to get into some of the capabilities of the associative balloons in drawings and custom properties. Because I think a lot of users out there are familiar with the concept of associative balloons, meaning I tag a part in my drawing with a balloon, and the balloon is linked to the item number in the bill of materials, right? But it's more than that. You can do things like link the balloon to the part number, for instance. So if you don't want to show item numbers linked to a BOM, but you'd rather show part numbers, you can do that. You can do that in the balloon option. So there's lots of little details that I want to go over that kind of surround this topic of the custom properties and balloons at the assembly level drawing. Now, as I always say with these webinars, again, please feel free to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions section there in the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll do my best to keep an eye on it, and as we go through things, I'll be answering the questions to the best of my ability. So let's dig into it. Now, I want to start with, again, a simple introduction into what is a simultaneous bill of materials. In Onshape, as of the most recent update, forgive me, 2 updates ago now, the end of March, we added the ability to have a simultaneous bill of materials in Onshape. And it's in the assembly level. You'll see the BOM table tab icon, and it flies out from the right, very similar to simultaneous sheet metal or our configurations functionality. It uses that fly out mechanic on the right, and you'll see a list of all your parts. The bill of materials is fully integrated directly into the assembly, so it's not a table that's just dropped into your drawing. It's a functioning piece of the interface at the assembly level, and it's automatically created. It also updates in real time, so as you insert more parts, you're going to see the bill of materials automatically update. The biggest thing that I'd like to stress about the simultaneous bill of materials is it really provides you a new way to interact with your assembly. It's not just a list of parts. If you click on it, it will cross-highlight. So if I select something in the bill of materials, it highlights in the instance list and in the graphics. So it's an easy way to identify things. Say that I wanted to hide all instances of a certain part. It's very easy for me to select a row in the bill of materials, right-click hide, from the graphics. And so it's a very easy way to interact with your model. You can also edit the properties of the parts. And in my opinion, this is the easiest way that we have for editing metadata associated with your parts or subassemblies in the bill of materials. So you can go in and edit the part number, edit the description, edit other fields, and make those adjustments without going into the workspace properties. You're never leaving that environment. Right? So, in my opinion, this is one of the easiest ways to add metadata to your assembly, to your parts and subassemblies. So again, just keep that in mind. You don't really have to do anything. If you don't want to use a bill of materials, you don't have to. It's going to be calculated automatically. In the behind the scenes, so to speak, you're going to see a bill of materials calculated anytime that you create an assembly. And then you can click on the tab to flat and see what you have. So that's a simple introduction into the simultaneous bill of materials. One question I get asked often is, well, what's different about this than what I may have used in the past? So if you have experience with a SolidWorks, for instance, the bill of materials is kind of just this table that you insert into the drawing. It's not really an object that you interact with, at least in most people's scenarios. So it's more of a just an annotation, so to speak, in the drawing rather than something that you would interact with at the assembly level. So keep in mind, I think a lot of the old CAD users' workflows they're typically, the bill of materials is just the table that I insert at the end. But in Onshape, the bill of materials is this interactive table that you can work with in the assembly level. And so it makes cross-highlighting very easy. You can do things like exclude from BOM, edit the metadata, those types of things, and at a glance get a good idea of where your design is, even with things like state, very easily. So it's a neat way to interact with your assemblies. So that's the key thing that I would highlight, is that it's not just a table in your drawing. It's something to work with at your assembly level. So, final slide. What does this have to do with balloons and custom properties? Well, in the past, the workflow for creating assembly drawings has been somewhat cumbersome. You had to, manually insert, tables for the bill of materials, or use an app like OpenBOM to generate your bill of materials and insert that into Onshape. We didn't have a native bill of materials function. So, if all you were looking for is a simple bill of materials, we didn't have a native tool for that. We, of course, now do. The other aspect of this is the associative BOM balloons that were added on February 13th. So on February 13th this year, we added associative BOM balloons, and the BOM balloons are associative to the bill of materials, to the item number in the bill of materials. This means that if I move things around in my bill of materials, the balloons will update, right? And so you're no longer manually entering balloon numbers. There's a parametric reference between the two. If you move things in the BOM, the balloons will reorder to accommodate. And that is a very important aspect of assembly drawings. So what I mean by balloons and custom properties and the bill of materials is these things coming together in these most recent updates in general make the assembly drawing process much easier. Now you have an automatically generated bill of materials with a list of your parts. You have the very easy ability to insert that into a drawing. And when you insert balloons, they're going to be parametrically linked to that bill of materials. So it kind of completes that workflow from an assembly drawing perspective. And so that was the logic behind bringing these topics together into a webinar. Now, the last bullet there that I want to mention is, I've had a number of users request, what if I don't want item number, linked to the BOM? What if I want to show some property or a description or a name, for instance? And you can certainly do that. The balloon property can be assigned to a number of different things. So just keep in mind, I'll show you an example of this in just a bit, but if you have part number assigned, for instance, you can balloon and show the part number in the drawing. And I know that's a commonly asked question. So just keep that in mind. These are some of the things that you can now do. And the fact that it's associative, the fact the bill of materials is automatically generated just makes this workflow so much easier. All right, so let's jump into things and just show you what it is that I'm talking about. So we're going to start with the simultaneous bill of materials. This is, again, an automatically generated thing. So every time you create an assembly, you start inserting parts, you're going to see a BOM table icon on the right over here. That is how you access the bill of materials. Now, as I mentioned before, it's automatically generated and it updates in real time. So if I were to insert more parts, insert more instances of the same part, you would see new rows or quantities change in this bill of materials as I go through and do that. So it's an interactive way to look at your assembly. Now, I mentioned before, it's also cross-highlighting. So if I select something in the bill of materials, it selects that thing in the graphics, and it also selects that in the instance list of the assembly. The reason this is so valuable is it means that I can go in and find something, for instance, like this spool, and then left click and just simply hide, right? Or hide the entire subassembly, right? But it will bring into focus whatever it is that you've selected, and it will do that in the instance list. It will also highlight it in the graphics. It just makes it very easy to select things, from the BOM and then act on them. Right click, hide, edit, go into the actual part studios associated with it if you wanted to. Just a very easy way to get around. So that's one of the big benefits that I would point out about the actual simultaneous bill of materials is that cross-highlighting ability. Now, also with the simultaneous bill of materials is the ability to display it in two different fashions. If you're looking for just a simple parts list of all the parts in this assembly, that would be flattened. If you're looking for a structured bill of materials that shows your subassemblies and the parts within those subassemblies, that's of course the option for structure. If I choose structured, you'll see that I have two subassemblies, the crank and the spool subassembly, and if I double click on them, it expands out with each of the parts within that subassembly. So it's giving you that nested structure that you'd expect from a top-level assembly subassembly relationship in the bill of materials, right? So another commonly asked question, how do we manage that structured relationships with top-level assemblies and subassemblies? You'll see that option under BOM type at the top. And you also see this option, by the way, when you're choosing to insert your bill of materials at the drawing level. Right. All right. Now, I mentioned before that this is a very unique way and a very easy way to edit metadata. And in my opinion, this is much easier than going to your workspace properties and doing it that way. If you have, a series of properties that you always find yourself editing, add that as a column into your bill of materials. And then you have the ability to edit it right here from the assembly. And just as a reminder, in the past, you would typically do things like go to the document menu, go to workspace properties, drill down into the workspace. So, I'm somewhat removed from the assembly, right? I can edit the metadata here. Here's description and part number and so on. But, I'm not looking at the assembly. I'm not in the assembly. So in my opinion, just going into, part number, double clicking and typing in a new part number, it's a really powerful thing to be able to do just right from the assembly level. So again, you can edit metadata that is editable, right? It's not associated with a version or anything like that. You can also add columns. So I can add a revision column or a state column. Vendor, you can even add, others as well. So just keep in mind, you can add your own columns to the BOM table. You can right-click and remove columns or move them around left to right as you choose. And the reason that's so important is whatever you see here is exactly what's inserted into the drawing, which I'll show you in just a moment. So it's important to keep in mind, the way that the bill of materials is structured here is exactly what you'll see when you insert that into the drawing. So we've discussed adding and removing columns. Again, we've discussed editing the metadata. If you double click a cell, you can type in anything you want and you are editing that metadata from there. So it's a very easy way to edit the properties of your document. Also, in the top right menu, you have this option for export to CSV. One of the more common questions that we get is, do we communicate with some other system? Is there a way to send my bill of materials out and be imported by some other PLM system or ERP system, something along those lines? And the short answer is yes. You can take the bill of materials directly from the BOM table here and export to CSV. And chances are your downstream application will support the import of that CSV. So, very commonly asked question, is there a way to communicate the bill of materials downstream with other applications? And the short answer would be that export to CSV. Now, one other concept that I haven't covered about the bill of materials is this concept of exclude, right? In the right-click menu, if you right-click on something in your BOM table, you have the option to exclude from bill of materials. And the reason that's so important, of course, is it will not show it in the list. The natural question that we get when we show exclude from bill of materials is, how do I show that again if I wanted to? And you have this option to show excluded under that same ellipsis menu in the top right corner. So show excluded, the idea behind that is, again, it will show all those things that you've right-clicked on and defined as excluded from the bill of materials, right? But those are things that if you wanted to not show them in the bill of materials, especially if you insert that in the drawing, I know that's a commonly asked question, that's what I would do. I would right-click, exclude from bill of materials, and then when you insert, you won't see it. All right, so that is kind of the simple, short explanation on simultaneous bill of materials. Just keep in mind it's automatically generated. It updates in real time, and it's also dependent on the order in your instance list. So it's taking the same order from top to bottom in the instance list and making that the order that you see here. And so if I start dragging things around, what you'll see is them shift around in real time in my bill of materials. Right? So that's where it's getting that item number order. All right, so how does this tie in to the concept of balloons and custom properties? And there are two kind of aspects of that. The custom properties is an important aspect of adding metadata. And I've already shown you how you can edit the metadata here. Right, so I've edited the part number or description. I could add other columns and edit those values as well. So that's the important aspect of editing the custom properties. The other element of this is how it ties into the drawing and how does that workflow look like. So now that we have, let's say our finished assembly and we've gone through the bill of materials, we've added our part numbers and descriptions. And by the way, with the new release management functionality, you can even automate some of that part number generation as well. But now that we've done this, how do we create the drawing of it? So let's drop into a drawing quickly and walk through that workflow. Now, of course, the first thing that we need to do is insert our bill of materials, right? So we have already our isometric view in the corner here, and I want to choose the Insert BOM option, right? Now I choose Insert BOM. Now one thing to point out is by default, it's going to grab that bill of materials from the assembly, right? So you can see in this case, it's grabbed the fishing reel assembly, the flattened BOM. Remember I told you before, you have flattened or structured, right? How you choose to show that is up to you, and how you want the order to go from top to bottom or bottom to top. But from here, it's really a process of just left-clicking where you want to place the bill of materials. So once you've defined this is the assembly that I want for my bill of materials, this is the BOM type and the order, just left-click and it places that bill of materials. Right? So as I mentioned before, remember this is the same exact orientation, same list, same rows, and everything that you see in the assembly level. So it's simply taking that and inserting it into a table here in Onshape, in the drawing. So we have our automatically generated bill of materials. We can insert it with the Insert BOM, choose whatever assembly I want, left-click, and place it. Now we get into the concept of adding balloons, and that's the typical workflow, right? We have our assembly, we design it, we may edit the metadata associated, we create the drawing, we insert the bill of materials, and we start ballooning parts or subassemblies, right? In this case, we want to add a few balloons. Now this gets to the improvements made in February. In February, we added associative BOM balloons, and associative being the key word there, meaning they update if the bill of materials updates. And so by default, when you click balloon, right, the callout command, you'll see you can define what you want it to be, right? So I can go in and define item number, for instance, and define that as the criteria that I want for my callout. Now, you may have seen part number or description or revision, right? It really depends, what your goal is there. But then from there, it's really just a process of left click, right? Left click, left click. And all I'm doing is left clicking to define where the attachment point of my balloon is, moving out, left click to actually place the balloon. The item number is dependent on the table that you see here. So it's just using the item number from the bill of materials and using that to populate the item number in the balloon in this case, right? So I can continue on adding all of these balloons rather quickly here and have this, laid out, rather fast, right? So, and this is a part of the workflow that's changed. Prior to February, this was a much more manual process of editing balloon numbers, or, there was no parametric link between the two. So when I hit the green check OK, now I've inserted my bill of materials, again, automatically generated from the assembly, and I've inserted balloons that are linked to the item numbers in that bill of materials. So that's the important part of the workflow that I think in recent, in the past, was missing, right? And it's just much, much easier now. Now, I mentioned before that they are associative, meaning that if the bill of materials changes, these will update. So if I shift things around in my assembly and the bill of materials reflects that, of course, then I will have a change, that will, of course, reflect that, right? So, for instance, if I were to change, this case and shift it up to the top part in my list, the bill of materials instantly updates. The bill of materials in the assembly updates in real time, as I mentioned before. So you'll see now item 1 is the case where it was in the past item 2. And of course, that means the bill of materials here should update. Now, the drawing, like all things in Onshape, all drawings in Onshape, only updates when you tell it to, right? This is not updating in real time. So I hit refresh, the update there, and it goes back and updates both the bill of materials and, in this case, all of the balloons to accommodate. And so you'll notice this part that was referencing item number 2 just a moment ago is now referencing item number 1 because I shifted that around in the bill of materials at the assembly level, right? So the structure, the order that you're seeing is largely governed by what you've created there. And if you want to move things around in your assembly to reflect that, you just update your drawing to accommodate, right? And so you don't have to reassign balloons or re-enter bomb numbers or worry about things, getting out of sync, if you're manually typing in balloon numbers and things like that. So again, just keep that in mind when we talk about parametric link or actually associative between the two. That's what we're referring to. The ability to update the assembly and go in and update the drawing. All right, so I mentioned before that, this is a simple example where I've inserted bill of materials and I'm inserting balloons that are linked to the item number in the bill of materials. Very common, probably kind of the quintessential, assembly drawing view. But there are scenarios, and we've gotten a number of requests to do things like insert the part number into the balloon, right, or the call out, right? So say, for instance, I wanted to do something like that. Well, I'd select the same call out command from the toolbar, but rather than have, table, I can, item number, I should say, I can add something like part number, right? So I can say part number, and what I'd recommend, just as a caveat to that, is you can also edit the border size, the actual border shape. So if you don't want round callouts, you can have rectangle, triangle, and so on. But in this scenario, because part number is actually a string of characters, I think 5 or 6 characters, I'm going to use tight fit, right? And what that will do is define my balloon size based on the length of the part number, right? So now I'm inserting a balloon that's actually associated with the part number of the part. And most importantly, if that part number changes, the balloon will update after clicking that update button. So that's what we're referring to, not just associative to the item number in the drawing, but associative to things like custom properties, right? So you're not limited by the ability to just insert item numbers. You can insert any custom property basically that you would like. You can define the text size, the actual shape of the callout, right? I'm using balloons here in this case defined as circles, but it could be rectangles, triangles, underlines, or nothing at all. And as I mentioned before, you could explicitly define character size, or you can just say tight fit and it will wrap that callout around the number of characters that are in your field. Also worth mentioning is you can add a prefix, a suffix, things before and after and to the left and right of the callout. So if you had like a 4x you wanted to type here, or typical, or those, any kind of custom callout that you may want to associate with, or excuse me, any kind of annotation, any kind of additional numbers or text that you want associated with the callout, you can add, top, bottom, left, or right. But that's the one last thing I wanted to really stress there is the ability to add not just simple balloons tied to item numbers in the bill of materials, but also things like the metadata, part number, those types of fields. So that is kind of the simple overview of the workflow. Again, it really all starts at the assembly level. At the assembly level, you're going to be inserting parts and building your assembly. And as you do that, the bill of materials will automatically be calculated and accessible via this BOM table icon. So if at any time you want to see what your bill of materials is going to look like, left click here. It's also a very good way to edit the metadata. So just a tip, if you're looking for a simple way to insert part number, description, whatever field that you find important, you can do that here. Once this looks good and you're ready to take this and insert into the drawing, we've just shown you that workflow. It's very, very simple. You literally choose Insert BOM, choose your BOM type from the assembly that you want, and left click to place it. And from that point forward, all of your callouts will be associative. Right, so they'll be associative either to the item number, like in the first example, or to whatever property that you feel is necessary. Right. So that's kind of my simple introduction into that workflow. And I wanted to show this. I know it's a short webinar, but I wanted to show this mainly because this workflow has changed so dramatically recently. And for those users out there that have been using Onshape a while, know that this is much easier than it had been in the past. Now, one final topic that I wanted to mention before we wrap things up here is the concept of custom properties. And I do want to mention this just briefly because I think it pertains to a lot of companies out there. So if your company has custom metadata, not the default fields that Onshape provides you with, but custom metadata specific to your organization, what you'll find under your account settings as a company owner or admin, important caveat there, must be a company owner or admin. If you go to your account settings in the top right, you'll see My Account. I can go to Properties, and here I can change or create properties. Right? So I can create my own custom properties, and the custom properties can have different types. So I can have booleans, I can have integers, dates, users that are actually linked to user profiles. So it's a very intelligent way to build in the company-specific metadata that you have. And what's really neat about this is once you've created your custom property, you click Create, it's automatically propagated to everyone in your company. So there's no need to manually initiate any kind of custom property changes. Once it's added here by a company owner or admin, it's visible by everyone. And it ties into all of the other themes that we've been talking about here today, right? So the editing of the bill of materials, the linking to the balloons, those types of things are very important workflows for a lot of organizations. So that's kind of my final comment on this. We've done past webinars and topics, videos and things like that, specifically on creating custom properties. So I'll save you from that. But keep in mind, if you're interested in this topic, definitely check out those past webinars and videos that we've done on this. But this kind of rounds out the theme of taking that real assembly with the custom metadata, and creating a professional level assembly drawing with the associated balloons, the automatically inserted BOM. Again, that workflow has just dramatically changed in the last few months. All right, so that is what I had planned for you. I am going to stick around and answer any questions that you have. So please feel free for the next few minutes to ask any questions that you'd like, and I'll make sure to get to all of them before we wrap things up. One final topic that I had for you, one final thing that I wanted to mention here is if you're interested in learning more, definitely check out the Onshape Learning Center. You'll find it at learn.onshape.com. There's self-paced training, instructor-led training, as well as technical briefings, all valuable resources for learning Onshape. So that's what I had planned. I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining. Again, I'm going to stick around and answer any questions that you like, so please feel free. But that's it. Thank you, and have a good day.